Alright, Shalom guys. We are doing week 4 in our in-depth dive into the Moedim, the appointments of our Heavenly Father. And today we're going to look at what people often will refer to as spring feasts, and those Moedim that take place at the beginning, at the front of end of the year. And so I've called this from Passover to Shavuot. So Passover beginning in the spring and then heading us right over to Shavuot, which takes a while, but that's basically in the summertime that we get to that Feast of Weeks. All right, so as we've spoken of before, you'll see on the picture behind me, I gave that picture a few weeks ago. Go over, try and pencil the different Moedim in, get as much detail as you can on the page, and so that you can just familiarize yourself with his seasons and go over the things again. But we're chiefly dealing with the front end, the blue part, heading up to Shavuot with the sevens, with the orange, that orange block there, and so let's get into it. What we know is that the biblical calendar begins with what is called the Aviv, or the month of the Aviv. We read in Exodus and in Deuteronomy that it talks about we should keep the month of the Aviv. In Deuteronomy chapter 16 verse 1, it's a good chapter to get a nice summary of specifically the feasts, the 3 feasts that were done in Jerusalem. There's a lovely little summary of those 3 in particular in Deuteronomy 16. You'll see that it begins with, observe the month of Aviv, and keep the Passover unto Yehovah your God. For in the month of Aviv, Yehovah your God brought you forth out of Egypt by night. And this brings up the first of the Moedim that we commemorate and we keep in the springtime, and that is the Pesach, or the Passover. And so you could read about that in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 13. Those 2 chapters speak a lot about the Passover, the night of the Passover, and what is called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so you'll see next to me, Passover begins. Pesach begins on the 14th, and it's described as on the 14th day. There's a lot of debate around that. I could spend 3 hours trying to get into that, but there's differing opinions on which evening of the 14th to keep it. But we read about this Pesach, the Passover, a very important term for us as believers. And so let me read about this with regards to this night, important night of deliverance, when Israel ate it, and we eat in remembrance. And so where do we get this idea of the 14th? Well, Exodus 12 verse 6 says, and you shall keep it, this is referring to a lamb that was put aside, you shall keep it up until the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening. And by evening, it's translated as that. The Hebrew says bein ha'arbaim, between the evenings, and this has caused a lot of debate and searching to understand what was understood of between the evenings, which we're not going to get into here. But as we read, you keep it until the 14th day, and you kill it between the evenings. And what we see is that it says in verse 7, they shall take of the blood, strike it on the 2 posts, the upper doorposts of the houses, wherein they shall eat it. And they shall eat the flesh in that night, roast with fire and unleavened bread. And with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Eat not of it raw, nor sodden it all with water, but roast with fire, his head with his legs and with the purtenance thereof. And you shall let nothing of it remain until morning, and that which remains of it until the morning you shall burn with fire. This is why it's often called the night of the Passover. Makes sense, because what we see is that by the morning the ritual was done, the meal was completed, and so it was for the night. Then there is then we have the next period, which is from the 15th through to the 21st of that first month, and is what is called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So, the Feast of Unleavened Bread is connected to the actions that follow after the Passover. I've said it before that Israel had to reenact the leaving of Egypt, and a lot of the Feast of Unleavened Bread actually is connected to that. It's connected to Israel's departure. Now, often we connect it to the unleavened bread eaten with the lamb at Passover, but the scriptures point us towards more events that happened afterwards. And people don't really highlight this so much, but we see when Moses gave Israel the instructions from our Heavenly Father, that it's connected to what happened after that night of the Passover. So we can read in Deuteronomy 16 verse 3, you shall eat no leavened bread with it. 7 days shall you eat unleavened bread therewith, even the bread of affliction, for you came forth out of the land of Egypt in haste. So there's this thing about a hasty retreat and the 7 days of eating unleavened bread, that you may remember the day when you came forth out of the land of Egypt all the days of your life. Now here again, I think we're getting the second use of day, that you need to remember this period when you came out of Egypt. And we see part of it is this issue of hastiness, and that there's unleavened bread connected to the hastiness. So we see this again in Exodus chapter 12, verses 33 and 34. And the Egyptians were urgent upon the people that they might send them out of the land in haste. For they said, we be all dead men. And the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading troughs being bound up in their clothes upon their shoulders. What's interesting with the Exodus when we read it is there wasn't, with that original Passover, it doesn't seem as though they were instructed to have no leaven in the house during the rite. The eating of the unleavened bread with the Passover reflects perhaps more what was done with a lot of the sacrifices in the temple, that often accompanying sacrifices you would eat them with unleavened bread. And then the injunction on removing all leaven from your house, this seems to be a bit more connected with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But what we see here is that they didn't have time. So they had leaven, but they didn't have time to leaven their loaves. They had to leave in haste. And so we see there's this reason for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Leviticus 23, verses 5 and 6. In the 14th day of the first month between the evenings is Yehovah's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread unto Yehovah. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. Now I want to move on to something that's a bit, I don't want to say it's controversial, but it's something that's definitely happened over time, and that is to define Passover. So we've started with Passover, it's followed by the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But what we see with time is that Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread have become very blurred. Originally it was Passover on the 14th, the feast from the 15th through to the 21st, and the feast being 7 days, Passover being a night. And so it's important to just see how Passover was, or the Pesach was originally used. And Nehemiah Gordon's done some good research on this. But when you get into the Hebrew, it's quite interesting, its use. All right. Firstly, when the Pesach was originally spoken of, it referred to the lamb. Okay. And that lamb could be of a goat or a sheep. Okay, it's just a young one of goats or sheep. There's nothing wrong with a Passover goat, just by the way. Lamb just refers to a young one. It could have been a kid. All right, but with the use of the description of Pesach, we can read like in Exodus 12:11, and so you must eat it with your loins girded, shoes on your feet, staff in hand. You shall eat it in haste. It is Yehovah's Passover. And the connection here that you can see if you get the full context is it's referring specifically to the lamb, to the sacrifice. Originally, the Pesach was the Pesach lamb. The lamb was the Pesach. The Pesach referred to that lamb. So, what's interesting is that when we look at the Tanakh, originally the Tanakh, when we look at the use of Pesach, it's connected directly with that offering. But with time, it's become associated with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The people today will even speak of the Feast of Passover. Okay, and again, usually the description, you can look in Exodus 12 and 13, you see the two different Moedim, but Passover is described as a rite or a service or a sacrifice. And it avoids, in the whole of the Tanakh, we don't see Chag Pesach. We don't see a feast of Passover. What we see is a night of the Passover. There's a rite, a ritual, a service, a sacrifice that was eaten, and so this is interesting. Okay, and I think it's perhaps due to an English, well, in the Western world, we've made it out that it's Jewish feasts, and so everything's feast there, and we are too quick to just translate things as feasts. In the whole of the Torah, you don't find the feast of Passover, okay, except for one place. There's always an exception to the rule, but because this kind of occurs once, it causes us to look at it a bit deeper and see, is it being translated properly here? And that scripture is Exodus 34 verse 25. So this is the only place. And so it speaks here and it says, you shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leaven. That word for sacrifice could be like slaughter, my slaughtered animal. Neither shall the sacrifice of the feast of the Passover be left unto the morning. And here we see this use of feast with Passover, and so a lot of people say, well, there's maybe, if it's called feast here, feast of Passover, feast of unleavened bread, they're meant to be used synonymously, even though they aren't actually used in that way. So, and because it's only used once, it really screams for we should look at this a bit deeper. And so, if we look at Exodus 34 verse 25 and get into it, we do see that it is the word Chag. Chag is traditionally translated as feast. Okay, we know Chag HaMatzot. It's just called that again and again, the feast of matzah, unleavened bread. Chag SHAVUOT, the feast of weeks. Chag Sukkot, the feast of tabernacles. So we do have Chag Pesach here. But because it's used once, we just are cautious about this, and so we need to re-look at this. Now, Stone's translation is quite good in this regard. Stone's shows that the word chag has two main uses, and chag is typically about the meat. About when you feast, there's usually a piece of meat, like that offering, that sacrifice. The meat, and so the one use is as festival, as a feast, how we typically use the term feast. But there is another which is about the actual the meat, the offering, that element of the sacrifice. And we see this use where it needs to be translated as chag, needs to every now and then be translated as sacrifice, rather than just assuming it's a feast or going in that direction. An example is Psalm 118 verse 27, where it says, God is Yehovah, which has showed us light. And then it says, bind the chag with cords, even unto the horns of the altar. And every translation I've seen here, the context is demanding that you translate chag as bind the sacrifice with cords. All right? Or the offering with cords. It's speaking about the meat. It's not about, you can't bind a feast. Okay, so there is this context. So the question is, how should we understand the context of Exodus 34 verse 25? Especially because we see that the Passover was all about a sacrifice. It was all about a sacrifice and an offering. That was the focus of the whole night. And is there a way in which we could see, well, maybe it's meant to be a feast? Again, there are problems with that. This is why I'm going down this line. But we actually get a lovely way in which we can resolve this and see, no, they weren't trying to elevate it to this Moed as a feast, but we can see it was, Exodus 34 is speaking about it in a sacrificial sense. And the reason is because we have another passage which almost reads exactly the same, and is speaking about such similar things that we can see that the context, if you just remove Passover, they wouldn't have translated as feast, but as sacrifice or an offering. This is Exodus 23 verse 18. So let me just read again Exodus 34:25. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leaven, neither shall the sacrifice of the chag of the Passover be left unto the morning. And we can even, as I'm reading it that way, it's kind of pointing towards the offering, the meat. Exodus 23:18 reads exactly the same, and here the translators do translate chag as sacrifice. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, neither shall the fat of my sacrifice chag remain until the morning. So here we see that, okay, there's one use where everyone says, see, Passover is a feast. No, we see that our Heavenly Father goes out of his way to make a degree of separation, that the time of the Pesach isn't used, that this issue of Chag Pesach is not used. And there could be reasons for this. Mainly the issue of rejoicing and celebrating. All right, Passover, the themes of Passover are more solemn, I believe, and more circumspect. This is when the judgment was poured out on Egypt. This is when an offering was made, a lamb had to lose its life, and it's a night of fear and dread. May the blood protect us from the destroying angel. And so there's a seriousness and a solemnness that should be there. So that's something quite interesting just to point out. But what we do see is that with time, Passover has been made broader than just the meal. Broader than just the sacrifice. It's gone from being the sacrifice to the meal, where we think to eat the lamb with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, as is described in the scriptures, that's to eat the Passover. To be more specific and correct, no. What it is when you're eating the lamb, that is the Passover, and with the Passover you are to eat it with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. Okay? So originally it really is the sacrifice. Then with time, what's happened is it's become the feast of unleavened bread. We see this more and more. And where originally in the scriptures it seems to be a little bit more separate. They follow on from each other, but anyway, what we see is that even in the Jewish calendar today, it's almost like Chag HaMatzot. It's kind of fallen off the way. And in a Jewish calendar, if you have the calendar, you'll see it'll be Passover day 1, Passover day 2, Passover. So and even in Christianity, they speak about Passover week. It's kind of become a lot bigger. Don't get me wrong, it was extremely significant, but it was it was used in a very tight way originally, where it's getting bigger and bigger. I believe even with in the Catholic Church today, when they go from Easter Sunday all the way up to Pentecost to Shavuot and their counting, that they call that also this is the season of the Passover. So it's really gotten bigger than what it originally was. But what we see originally was in the scriptures, it's defined as on the 14th day, relating to the sacrifice. All right, the next thing I just wanted to talk about is that don't forget that the Moedim are connected with harvest festivals. 3 of them in particular, and we read about these in Exodus, related to harvest, ingathering, very agrarian. And so, yes, it is a time where during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you remember how Israel was eating unleavened bread, left in haste, a new beginning as a nation. But also at that time, while they were keeping this, they would be bringing a harvest up. And we see this connecting of a harvest to this theme, and this harvest being that of the barley harvest in the season or the month of the Aviv harvest, where they needed to take a first fruits offering up. Now, the first fruits offering is this first fruits offering that was given during that week, is not specified as on a specific day of the month. In the whole of, it's only mentioned, I think, a couple of times, maybe even just once in Leviticus 23, but we're not given a calendar day. All right, let me just read of it. Leviticus 23, 9 to 11. Yehovah spoke unto Moshe, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say unto them, When you come into the land which I give you, and shall reap the harvest thereof, okay, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest unto the priest. Okay, this makes absolute sense in terms of Israel would be going up to Jerusalem for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, so it would be an offering brought up for this time. And he shall wave the sheaf before Yehovah to be accepted for you. And then we get this description, on the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. Now, the question is what was understood by the morrow, or the day after the Sabbath. So, as said, when looking at Numbers 28 and 29, notice which Moedim our Heavenly Father could not give a calendar date for. Look in Leviticus 23 for the same. And here we see, this is the first time we get a Moed where we had to do something. Israel would bring that offering where we don't do this on this day of the month. And the question is why? And what is happening here is that we have 2 cycles at play. And for the other Moedim, where we can just say the Day of Atonement is on the 10th day of the 7th month, we can link it to the monthly cycle. Clearly, with this Day of First Fruits, we can't link it to the monthly cycle. And so there's just this description of, you shall offer it on the day after the Sabbath. And what it links it to instead is the weekly cycle, the 7-day count that we understand since we brought up by tradition, the most ancient tradition of all time, is the 7-day count where we go from Sunday, the first day of the week, through to Shabbat, Saturday. Even the church affirms Saturday is the 7th day of the weekly cycle, Monday is the first day. And so it suddenly links it to this weekly cycle, and the description is here, on the morrow after the Sabbath. Now, how did ancient Israel understand this? And there's a lot of debate, but I'm going to give what is the typical general understanding of what was understood of this offering given on the first day of the week after the Shabbat. So, the Jewish people today, they say that the Sabbath being spoken of there, they do link it to the moon. Okay, even though the passage doesn't link it to the moon, they say no, the Sabbath being spoken of there is the rest day that is on the first day of the week of unleavened bread, on the 15th day of the week of unleavened bread. And we get that in Leviticus 23. It says that first day of that week, it shall be a rest day. And they say it's referring to the 15th day of the week. So therefore, the day after the Sabbath is the 16th day. Now, a lot of us in the Hebrew movement, we don't subscribe to that. And so just so you understand why there are different reckonings of this first fruits offering. And I've got here 3 reasons. I've got more, but I'll get into some of the others when we get to the Feast of Weeks. But the first one is that, as said before, we see that our Heavenly Father, if He could give it a day of the month, He would do that. But we see clearly here with the day on which they would offer the first fruits, that there is no day of the month given. It's described as the day after the Sabbath. Okay, that's the first point. The second one is that whenever the Sabbath is used generally and without further clarification, we typically understand this to be referring to the 7th-day Sabbath, the normal 7th-day Sabbath that we get every week. For instance, if I tell someone I'll see you on the Shabbat, most people today would understand I would be talking about the next weekly Sabbath that would be coming up. They wouldn't say to me, well, which Shabbat? Is it this Shabbat or that Shabbat, or these special Shabbats that we get within the calendar? If you give no further clarification, the day after the Sabbath is referring to the 7th-day Sabbath. The third reason why we disagree with Judaism's take on this is that the term Shabbaton is not used. And this takes a bit of explaining, but just so you understand that when we have new kind of or yearly special holidays, let's say like the first and the last day of Sukkot, they are described as rest days, or the first and last days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they're described as rest days. The term used in the Hebrew is not Shabbat. It is the term for these rest days is called Shabbaton, and it implies a kind of less strict use of the word Shabbat. It is about ceasing, you do cease, but it's not as heavy. The use isn't as heavy as the use of Shabbat as in the weekly Sabbath, and it's specifically used for the weekly Sabbath, and none of the other Moedim, except, interestingly enough, for the Day of Atonement, for Yom HaKippurim. And this implies just a seriousness and an extra level of Sabbath keeping, Shabbat being stronger, where Shabbaton is used for these other days. So there again, if this was referring to the first day of the week of unleavened bread, you would expect that the term Shabbaton would be used. I hope you understand these things. So, and what we understand is that within this week, from the 15th to the 21st, basically the Sunday that occurs within that week, that will be the day when the first fruits would be given. So Israel's up there in Jerusalem for that whole week, and then whichever is the first day, the Sunday that would be in that week, that would be the day on which they would offer the first fruits. From there we move forward to the Feast of Weeks, and it takes a while to get there, as is given away in the title. But Shavuot is about weeks. You're counting weeks till we get there. And we can read about this. So we started with the first fruits of the barley harvest, and from that day when they offered the first fruits, they would then start counting 7 weeks. We get this in the text. Okay. So Leviticus 23 verse 15, we read, "And you shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete." Okay, this is another reason why the use of Sabbath to be referring to that the Shabbaton of the first day of the week of unleavened bread doesn't make sense, because it's talking about 7 Sabbaths, and it would seem to make sense in your weekly cycle. Verse 16, even unto the morrow, the day after the 7th Sabbath, shall you number 50 days. This is where we get Pentecost from, another term for this feast. 50. And you shall offer a new meat offering unto Yehovah. And so here we see how we get to Shavuot. As said, Deuteronomy 16 is specifically about the 3 times of going up to Jerusalem. Excuse me, I'm struggling here. And verses 9 and 10 deal with Shavuot. 7 weeks shall you number unto yourself, beginning to number the 7 weeks, from such time as you begin to put the sickle to the corn. That's when they would start harvesting on the day of first fruits, when they would offer that barley harvest. Interestingly, it's not described in Scripture as a Shabbat. And what we see here in Deuteronomy is actually it was as Israel was offering the first fruits, so Israel throughout the land could actually begin the harvest. And so we see this, but it says from that time, begin to count 7 weeks. Here the word week is used, okay? It's not saying 7 Shabbats, but we can understand from counting in the weekly cycle that you could describe it as 7 Shabbats or 7 weeks. And there we get we get to the Feast of Weeks, Chag, Shavuot, and speaks about the free will offering that you would give there in Jerusalem. All right, so now interestingly enough, because the first fruits was not in line with the moon cycle, what happens when you continue in the weekly cycle and you're just counting 7 sevens? Could we define the month, the day on the month where we find the Feast of Weeks? And the answer is no. How would we be able to know which day of the month would be the Feast of Weeks? And so interestingly, again, this is another one. So it's the day of that original first fruits that we see we can't get a month date for, and the same with Shavuot. We can't get a day of the month because it's not connected to the month, and so that makes sense. All right, what's interesting with understanding it as being the Sunday or the first day in the week that comes after the Shabbat is that both the day of the first fruits of the barley harvest and that of the wheat harvest are both brought on the first days of the week. So you have first fruit harvests brought on the first day of the week. I think that makes also a good, it fits the pattern. It makes a lot of sense. Okay, so that's how we get to the Feast of Weeks and anything with feast, and this is why I think Chag is taken from Pesach in terms of a feast, is that I put the smiley faces there, remember that, because you are to chagag, to feast in these things, have joy. The other word there is sameach, okay, happiness, joy. You shall dance and have a wonderful time. This is the attitude of the chagim, of the feast. And so now you see the counting and how the scriptures describe it. Okay, I want to talk about, we can start ending this off with just talking about the mess of Christianity with regards to these Moedim and these appointments, because Messiah came saying, do not add or subtract from these things. And Christianity in many ways, believing faith, the church has wandered so far from these original descriptions. Let's begin with Passover. despite our struggle, and there's a genuine struggle between the synoptics and the Gospel of John with the Last Supper, and was it a Passover meal, and when did the feast begin, and is there separation, and it can get complicated. But despite all that, what Catholic faith has rendered Passover, or the Pesach, it just makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And what we see with in Catholic faith is that they have taken Pascha, they call it Pascha. It comes from the Hebrew, comes from Pesach, and they relate it to the Easter Sunday, okay, which is the first day of the week, but it's just confounding things. And anyway, they say no, the Pascha now, the true Passover, is it's meant to be on the first day of the week, and it is not meant to be. They remove all connotation of it to sacrifice or anything like this, and they say it's now concerned with the resurrection. I've read this on multiple Catholic sites, and it just makes no sense. But this is the thing, we're getting to the roots of our faith. When you join the Hebraic Roots movement, we get to the roots of our faith, and you just realize, hold on, you can't change. You can't make these kind of changes. The Passover is directly linked to a sacrifice. And the season, we understand Messiah dying and whatever, it would make sense that we would understand it in terms of his death and sacrificial side of things. And it makes no sense to relate it to the resurrection. But this is what they've done. Alright, the other thing is they've then, by doing it to the day of the first fruits, on the first day of the week, the resurrection happened then, they've also fixed it. They've fixed it to the weekly cycle, where originally we see, no, the Passover was not in any way connected to the weekly cycle. It was connected to the monthly cycle. And so the 14th day of the month could be on any day of the month. All right, Passover should be able to be on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, whenever. And so that's another shift that has happened. Now, interestingly enough, there is evidence that there were people in the early church who stood against this. And there were those who took on the church and said, hold on, the Passover has to be related to the 14th day of the month. And these people were called quartodecimans. Now that's a long fancy word, but quarto, 4, deci, 10, 14thers. That's another way of saying it. They were 14thers. We should do it on the 14th. What's this got to do with the resurrection? Okay, the original description, if it's given in the scriptures, is about sacrifice, freeing from slavery and bondage, price being paid, atonement, those kind of themes. It makes sense as believers that we would understand Passover in that light. We cannot change the original meaning and what these things symbolize. So let me read about the quartodecimans. Where did I get this from? You'll find it in the documents I gave you, encyclopedia.com, and there's a lot on these guys. And the church fathers considered them heretics, and I think the things they stood for make a lot of sense. The term quartodeciman refers to those Christian communities in the early church which celebrated Easter on the 14th of Nisan, the day of the Jewish Passover, Exodus 12 verse 6. Prevalent in Asia Minor, it's Turkey and Syria in the 2nd century. Quartodecimans emphasized what? The death of Messiah. That makes absolute sense. The true paschal victim. John 18:28, 1942. While Roman practice emphasized the observance of Sunday as the day of the resurrection. Just changed Paschal to mean the resurrection. Implicit in these two positions is the disputed chronology of the Holy Week. Romans' effort to induce the Quartodecimans to abandon their practices were unsuccessful. They rebelled against Rome, but Rome was gaining in political might. So we eventually have Saint Polycarp of Smyrna. He goes to Rome and discusses this question with Pope Anicetus, without, however, reaching agreement. You would think Passover could just mean what it originally meant and surround the sacrifice as it was originally meant to be. Anyway, Pope Victor, he sought unity through a series of synods held between East and West. All accepted the Roman practice, except the Asiatic bishops. When Victor attempted coercion by excommunication, you either do it Rome's way or you're out. Saint Irenaeus of Lyons, he intervened to restore peace. That's Eusebius speaks about this in terms of church history. During the 3rd century, Quartodeciman waned. Okay, it died out. Rome managed to just suck the life out of these true practices which were once there. And it says it persisted in some of those communities down through to the 5th century. All right, even in the Celtic church, because they just they became believers in Messiah through Catholic, I think it was through Augustine who got to the Celts, and then, they just started doing it as the Bible said, and they even got into big trouble, and the Pope had to sort them out, but they were reading it, Passover on the 14th, makes sense. Alright, so it doesn't take a genius to view Messiah's death as connected to the Passover. And it has nothing to do with the resurrection. Alright. It has to do with an offering that redeemed Israel. The offering, firstborns of Egypt died. And a lamb took the place to save Israel. And provide freedom. And deliver them from Egypt. Okay, perhaps the night of the Passover in which Messiah died could have been on Thursday night, as the majority of the church believes. The night of the Passover, that year which Messiah died. A lot of the church believe he ate a Passover with his disciples before he died. Guys, if it was on a Thursday night again, even if it was in that generation, the scriptures do not say we are to connect it to the weekly cycle. So it's just wrong to fix it to a weekly sequence. Okay, it should happen around full moon, the 14th of the month. So the Quartodecimans are absolutely right, and it just makes no sense what the Catholics have done with equating it to the resurrection. Alright, now it's clear that Messiah's death should be associated with the Passover, and but there was even more that is troubling concerning the church's celebrations that happen in the springtime. Alright, there's a lot of festivity, eating Easter ham and all that kind of stuff, and bunnies and chocolate and that. But it's as though believers have completely forgotten the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay, think of the hot cross buns. It's in the season of what the scriptures call the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And actually there is a passage in 1 Corinthians where Paul advises people. He even says it, therefore let us keep the feast. And there's no doubt what feast he's talking about, because he's talking about unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And so it's just a mess what has happened with the calendar. Taken bits and pieces, and it's just been transformed into something else. All right, and then, in terms of Easter, all right, springtime, Okay, Easter, they say Easter is just another synonym for Passover, and we can still use it. Very doubtful, very doubtful. The Venerable Bede, historian, you can read the passage where he says, Easter month, which is now interpreted as the Paschal month, was formerly named after the goddess Easter and has given its name to the festival. So this is more in Germanic tribes, certain Germanic tribes like the English, and I think in Germany it's the case, they call it Easter. They're not Passover. Here it's saying it comes from the goddess Easter. And this explains, if you want to look at what Easter worship was about, bunny rabbits, and it's just fertility god stuff. And it makes a lot of sense to what are those bunny rabbits and eggs doing around at the Passover time. And so, okay, but let me not bash the Catholics and the Gentiles too much. When it comes to the counting of first fruits, we actually do count it like the Catholics, the day after the Shabbat, and we say the Shabbat is the seventh day. And what's interesting is that we can also understand that it was the first fruits day, and that Paul used imagery regarding the first fruits. For instance, in 1 Corinthians 15:20, concerning the resurrection, which was a symbol of a greater harvest. Okay, that's what first fruits represent. Not necessarily resurrection, but a greater harvest. It says, now Messiah is risen from the dead and become a first fruits of them that slept. We await a greater harvest. This is a small portion of a greater harvest. The same with, we then count the 7 weeks, and yeah, we do it like Catholics, and we eventually get to Pentecost, the 50th day again on the first day, and we know that the Spirit was poured out then. So this is kind of lining up. But again, the first fruit element, it's been lost. But how should we understand it? Well, even Paul, he says it also in Romans, where he describes us who are filled with the Spirit are first fruits unto him. So that generation that was there in Jerusalem filled with the Spirit, it's a small portion of a greater harvest that we can understand. So we can understand the scriptures that the times and seasons, especially the spring feasts and how they were fulfilled, if we go back to our roots, we actually see that the original apostles, they could keep it in keeping with how it was originally described. And in fact, it has a whole lot more meaning. Suddenly terms like Messiah being our Passover lamb makes a lot more sense. Suddenly this idea of us being the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, it makes more sense. We are finding a calendar rooted in the original that was given to him. And we've been separated from that. And so my prayer is that as you study his Moedim, his times and seasons, that you would do it the way in which he originally gave. That we feast when he tells us to feast, that we're serious when he tells us to be serious, that we're mindful of the themes he gives us to be mindful in their season. And as a believer, I pray that you would also do it, having faith in Messiah as our Passover lamb.